What we have here in chapter 19 is probably one of the most cloddish, boorish, heavy-handed marriage proposals in literary history. It is very funny. The whole section is very comical. Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth. Remember that he came to Longbourn originally to find a wife, and he set his sights originally on Jane as the eldest. But he then turns him to Elizabeth when he finds out that Jane is already spoken for. Well, as revealing of the character of Mr. Collins, we have to keep in mind that he is dull, tedious, boring, omnipresent, and that he is somebody who would make a very poor husband for anybody, especially somebody as vivacious as Elizabeth. When he first addresses Elizabeth, therefore, Collins immediately comes across as cloddish and boring. And I can't help but quote at length some of the things that he says. He says, for instance, in first addressing her, "You can hardly doubt the purport of my discourse. However your natural delicacy may lead you to dissemble, my attentions have been too marked to be mistaken. Almost as soon as I entered the house, I singled you out as a companion of my future life. But before I am run away with by my feelings on this subject, perhaps it would be advisable for me to state my reasons for marrying." Well, first notice, he says, "From the moment I came in, I saw you as the object of my future happiness." That's a bald-faced lie. He saw, if anyone, Jane as the object of his future happiness. And even there, it wasn't the future happiness he was thinking about as much as he was thinking about making some great offer of salvation to this family that he was going to drive into poverty when the father died. Well, in this same section, Collins also says, "I don't want to be run away with my feelings about the subject." That's, again, a piece of irony here, because he is anything but run away with by his feelings. He is not what we would call a passionate man at all. He's not a romantic man in any stroke of the imagination. And then he says, "Here are my reasons for marrying." As a word to the wise, when you go to propose to a woman, this is not what you want to do. You don't want to say, "My reasons for marrying are 1, 2, 3. It's not a checklist. When we fall in love with somebody else, there's no checklist that tells us, "Gee, I must be in love. This girl has eyes and feet and hands, and therefore I must love her." That's not the way that human beings react. So in many ways, Collins is an inhuman character. But remember, he's also a parody of Darcy. That Darcy's stiffness, his mannerisms, his containing himself all the time, is in some ways on the verge of being inhuman, almost monstrous. Comically monstrous in Jane Austen, but nevertheless monstrous. Well, his reasons for marrying are very funny, too. Collins says, "My reasons for marrying are, first, that I think it a right thing for every clergyman in easy circumstances, like myself, to set the example of matrimony in his parish. Secondly, that I am convinced that it will add very greatly to my happiness. And thirdly, which perhaps I ought to have mentioned earlier, that it is the particular advice and recommendation of the very noble lady whom I have the honor of calling patroness." One of the first things to notice is that this is very good rhetoric. You have 3 subjects, you bring up your 3 subjects and state them cleanly and openly and clearly, and you move on to explain each one. Notice also that he has them in good rhetorical fashion. He has them from the second greatest to the least to the greatest. The most important one is the third one. If that's the case, then, the least important is his happiness and her happiness. The most important is pleasing Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Very odd for somebody who's supposed to be in love with a woman. But notice also that he doesn't speak of Elizabeth's happiness. This is all about Collins' happiness. "You will make me happy, therefore I want you to marry me." Also, notice he's saying right out, "I think this is what one ought to do. One ought to be married. A clergyman should be married." Again, a very poor reason for being married. But the third reason, which is probably the most significant, as he says I should have mentioned it first, is that it would be pleasing to Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Well, if you're getting married to a man, imagine that the man you're marrying, you're always going to have the rich, powerful aunt in your living room, constantly. Lady Catherine de Bourgh has been on the lips of Collins from the second he walked in the door. And if Elizabeth is going to be married to him, she's going to have this other great lady looming over her for the rest of her married life. Not very attractive. Well, Collins goes on to make the case even worse for himself. He says, "I do not reckon the notice and kindness of Lady Catherine de Bourgh as among the least of the advantages in my power to offer. It remains to be told why my views were directed towards Longbourn instead of my own neighbourhood, where I can assure you there are many amiable young women." Now nothing remains but for me to assure you in the most animated language of the violence of my affection. To fortune I am perfectly indifferent, and I shall make no demand of that nature on your father, since I am well aware that it could not be complied with, and that £1,000 and the 4 per cents, which will not be yours till after your mother's decease, is all that you may ever be entitled to. On that head, therefore, I shall be uniformly silent, and you may assure yourself that no ungenerous reproach shall ever pass my lips when we are married. To break down what he's saying here, on the first he says, I do not reckon the notice and kindness of Lady Catherine as all unimportant. He reckons it as very important. Again, if Elizabeth were to marry him, she'd have this great lady looming over her for the rest of her life, constantly telling her what to do, what to think, how to act, how to dress, how to set up her kitchen, for goodness sake. Collins goes on to suggest then that I could have gotten a wife in my hometown, but I came to Longbourn instead. That reveals something very subtly here. The fact is that he comes to Longbourn because he couldn't find a wife in his hometown. The guy's a loser. He's a clod. And in his own hometown, there were plenty of women, none of whom wanted anything to do with him whatsoever. Further, he then says, I will never mention money and your poverty. But he just did mention her poverty, very rudely saying, you're never going to amount to anything financially unless you marry me. But I'll never mention that. It's a backhanded sort of swipe at Elizabeth. When he says that he'll never mention something, it's normally the opposite. He is actually mentioning it. He is actually making it very pronounced in his conversation. Well, Elizabeth tries to reject him. In fact, she tries to reject him multiple times. And each time he doesn't get it. He refuses to get it. So, for instance, she says, it is impossible for me to do otherwise than to decline your offer. And Collins responds, it is usual with young ladies to reject the addresses of the man whom they secretly mean to accept when he first applies for their favor, and that sometimes the refusal is repeated a second or even a third time. I am therefore by no means discouraged by what you have just said, and shall hope to lead you to the altar ere long. Well, she goes on to say, you could not make me happy. I'm convinced I couldn't make you happy either, and Lady Catherine would object to me. To which he says, no, I don't think she'd object at all. And again she tries, saying, this matter may be considered therefore as finally settled. And rising as she thus spoke, she would have quitted the room had Mr. Collins not addressed her. I know it to be the established custom of your sex to reject a man on the first application, and perhaps you have even now said as much to encourage my suit as will be consistent with the true delicacy of the female character. What is Elizabeth to do? She says, I don't know how to reject you. I've tried. I've said, no, what do you want me to say? The man persists so much. I mean, if a guy were to ask a girl out on a date or to ask her to dance, and she said, no, thank you, the conversation should end there. He should walk away. That should be sufficient evidence that she's not interested. But Collins doesn't get the ticket. He just keeps going and going and going, and she's baffled. How do you get rid of this guy? He's like a tick or a burr that won't get off your leg. Well, finally she says, I thank you again and again for the honor you've done me in your proposals, but to accept them is absolutely impossible. My feelings in every respect forbid it. Can I speak any plainer? But here's the real kicker, I think, because she says, do not consider me now as an elegant female intending to plague you, but as a rational creature. Collins' main problem, as the problem of several characters, is that he doesn't think of other people as rational characters. He sees them as he wants to see them. He sees her as an elegant female. He doesn't see her necessarily as a rational person, capable of thoughts and ideas and failings and woes like anybody else. Rather, he sees her as somebody who's just this delicate thing. And as Jane Austen herself says, this is willful self-deception. Elizabeth could make no reply to it, and immediately and in silence just leaves the room because she can't say anything to this. How do you respond to somebody who will not be self-critical, who refuses to stop their own self-deception? Well, this offer of marriage and then the rejection of it causes great tumult in the family, and Mrs. Bennet especially is quite angered by it and tries to get Mr. Bennet to get Elizabeth on board with marrying Collins. But Mr. Bennet himself says the following, an unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth. From this day you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do. Consequently, Elizabeth is left with an assurance that her father supports her in rejecting Collins. But between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, this also shows the rift between them. They are not united in mind. In a marriage, the couple should be united together, both of them being introspective, thinking about their life together and how they're going to make their lives better, not always at odds with each other. And here, Mr. Bennet, who represents pride, and Mrs. Bennet, who represents prejudice, are definitely contrary to one another. But that contrariness supports Elizabeth in rejecting Mr. Collins. And if we develop the character of Mr. Collins just one step further, he comes across not just as a fool at the end of the chapter, but as a bitter, self-deceiving man who himself is capable of great rudeness and violence to other people. And that rudeness actually comes out in his response after being rejected by Elizabeth. He doesn't take it very well. He says the following: "My dear madam, let us be forever silent on this point. Far be it from me," he presently continued in a voice that marked his displeasure, "to resent the behavior of your daughter. Resignation to inevitable evils is the duty of us all, the peculiar duty of a young man who has been so fortunate as I have been in early preferment, and I trust I am resigned, perhaps not the less so from feeling a doubt of my positive happiness, had my fair cousin honour me with her hand. For I have often observed that resignation is never so perfect as when the blessing denied begins to lose somewhat of its value in our estimation. You will not, I hope, consider me as showing any disrespect to your family, my dear madam, by thus withdrawing my pretensions to your daughter's favour, without having paid yourself and Mr. Bennet the compliment of requesting you to interpose your authority in my behalf. My conduct may, I fear, be objectionable in having accepted my dismission from your daughter's lips instead of your own. But we are all liable to error. I have certainly meant well through the whole affair. My object has been to secure an amiable companion for myself, with due consideration for the advantage of all your family, and if my manner has been at all reprehensible, I here beg leave to apologize." After he's been rejected by Elizabeth, not only is he still boring and still wordy, but he also says, she's not as attractive as I thought her originally. And I am correct. I am in the right. Pompous, full of himself, proud, delusional even. A man who goes about living in a way that he thinks he's always right, and with never an ounce of self-criticism or self-reflection or self-thought. This anger that he harbors against Elizabeth continues into the next chapter and even beyond that. We can't leave this section without mentioning the letter that is sent from Caroline Bingley to Jane. Caroline has gone back to their estate with Charles, her brother, and consequently Jane is left thinking, why did Charles leave me behind? And Caroline sends a letter. And here Caroline reveals not only that she herself is very protective, but that perhaps Darcy is in the wrong. That's certainly what Elizabeth thinks. Caroline's letter says this: "Mr. Darcy is impatient to see his sister, and to confess the truth, we are scarcely less eager to meet her again. I really do not think Georgiana Darcy has her equal for beauty, elegance, and accomplishments, and the affection she inspires in Louisa and myself is heightened into something still more interesting from the hope we dare entertain of her being hereafter our sister. I do not know whether I ever mentioned before to you my feelings on this subject, but I will not leave the country without confiding them, and I trust you will not esteem them unreasonable. My brother admires her greatly already. He will have frequent opportunity now of seeing her on the most intimate footing. Her relations all wish the connection as much as his own, and a sister's partiality is not misleading me, I think, when I call Charles most capable of engaging any woman's heart. With all these circumstances to favour an attachment and nothing to prevent it, am I wrong, my dearest Jane, in indulging the hope of an event which will secure the happiness of so many?" What appears kindness here on the part of Caroline is actually very cruel, because she knows that Jane likes her brother. Probably part of the reason why she's going back home with her brother, because she doesn't want her brother married to Jane. But also because she wants Darcy. She wants to be married to Darcy. And she's of the opinion that if her brother marries young Miss Georgiana Darcy, then she will be more prone, more in a position, to be able to marry Mr. Darcy and secure his money for herself. But she says this in such a way that it seems as though she's friends with Jane, but really it's very biting against Jane, knowing that Jane liked her brother. We perhaps know people like this. Girls especially who seem to be friends but actually end up being very shrewish, dragon-like, scratch your eyes out sort of attitude towards other girls. What this also does, though, is because it includes Darcy in the letter, it makes, again, Elizabeth think worse of Darcy than perhaps he deserves. Because of the circumstances, she now links Mr. Darcy to the unhappiness of her own sister. And because she's just had this awful experience with Collins, who himself parallels Darcy, she thinks worse of Darcy's manners and his haughtiness and his own attitude towards things. So she is becoming more and more prejudiced against Darcy as the story goes by. But she's also becoming more open to the idea that maybe her situation and her family is not ideal.